Hey y'all, welcome back. When it comes to unsolved cases in the Ozarks, there is one that stands out in the minds of many, including mine. The case of the three missing women, commonly known as the Springfield Three. I've spent months learning everything I can about this story, which actually, you can see my research board because I got no way to hide it. It has become very near to my heart. If I could see one case solved in my lifetime, this would be it. Springfield, Missouri has been called the Queen City of the Ozarks, a bustling city that still somehow manages to maintain its small town vibes. It's a place rich in history and lore, but under its pleasant surface, it's also a place with many dark secrets. June 6th, 1992 was a big day in Springfield, graduation day, for hundreds of high school seniors excited to begin the next chapter in their lives. The graduates of Kickapoo High School included 19-year-old Susie Streeter, a petite girl with shoulder-length blonde hair and brown eyes, and 18-year-old Stacy McCall, a blue-eyed beauty with waist-length dark blonde or light brown hair. Susie Streeter's mom, Cheryl Levitt, was 47 years old, a single attractive woman who, like her daughter, also had blonde hair and brown eyes. She was born September 1st, 1944 in Washington, and in 1964, she married Brent Streeter. Not long after, they had a son, Bart, and about 8 years later, on March 9th, 1973, their daughter, Suzanne Streeter, affectionately called Susie, was born. Cheryl and Brent divorced when Susie was only 6 months old. At some point after, Cheryl married again to a man named Frank. That relationship ended, and by 1980, she had married Don Levitt and relocated her family to Springfield, Missouri. But in 1989, they also divorced. One thing about Cheryl is she was not afraid to walk away from a relationship that had gone bad. She was a woman not afraid to be alone. Though she'd been married 3 times, Cheryl didn't often date. She was a long-term relationship type of gal, and all the serious relationships she had throughout her life ended in marriage. Though Cheryl was friendly and well-liked, she was also fiercely independent and a very private person. Much of what I was able to learn about her revolves around her work as a stylist at New Attitudes Hair Salon at 210 West Sunshine Street, where she had over 250 clients. When Cheryl and her kids moved from Seattle to Springfield, Bart was 16 and Susie was 8. And she seemed to adjust to this change much easier than her brother did. Over the next few years, he would fall in with some less than positive influences and develop a drinking problem. And he and Cheryl often argued, which led to him getting kicked out of the house when he was 17. Susie, on the other hand, thrived in Springfield. In the 2nd grade, she befriended Stacy McCall and her best friend, Janelle Kirby. The trio became fast friends, until Stacy's family briefly moved away when she was 11. The McCall family returned just 2 years later, but by then the girls' friendship had changed. Stacy and Janelle picked right back up and were still very close. But Susie had made new friends and was hanging out with a bit of a rowdier crowd. Susie was known to be a bit of a party girl with a thing for bad boys, or at least that's how she's commonly portrayed. The bad boy thing is true though. She did date some questionable guys. Just a few months prior, she'd broken up with her most recent boyfriend, Dustin Rekla, after he and 2 of his friends broke into a mausoleum and stole the gold teeth from a skull. Yeah. But we'll get back to that. Prior to Dusty, Susie had a 2-year relationship with 17-year-old Mike Kovacs, who she actually lived with the summer before senior year. And that also wasn't the first time that she had moved out of her mother's house. For a few months in the spring of 1992, she moved in with her brother, Bart, until a huge fight broke out between them about her brother's partying, and she moved back in with her mom. But it was pretty unusual for a high schooler to be able to just move out and live with their boyfriend and then their party boy brother. And that likely added to Susie's reputation as a wild child, a party girl herself. Susie was also a chain smoker, like her mom, which was also not something that a lot of high school kids did openly. But Cheryl and Susie had an unusual relationship. Cheryl, for the most part, seemed to take a kind of hands-off approach towards her kids. She gave them room to grow, to make their own mistakes and learn from them. But she was always ready to step in if they needed her, especially Susie, who she was especially close with. Though they did have arguments at times, like mothers and daughters do. It may have been a bit unconventional, but it worked for them. Stacy McCall's life was much more conventional. Her parents, Stu and Janice McCall, married in 1968, and they had 3 beautiful daughters. Stacy, the baby of the family, was born on April 23rd, 1974. She was a bright and bubbly girl, full of life and dreams for the future. She was a good student, and she had a part-time job at Springfield Gymnastics, and she also modeled wedding dresses for a store called The Total Bride. Stacy was well-loved, and she had several close friends. But since the time they were toddlers, her and Janelle Kirby had been best friends. They grew up together in Battlefield and remained close even in the few years that the McCall family moved away. After graduation, they both planned to attend Southwest Missouri State University, and they had exciting plans to join a sorority together. Stacy was a shining light with a promising future. But something that I've noticed about this case is that the two girls, Susie and Stacy, are often portrayed in a way that contrasts each other. Susie, the party girl, and Stacy, the good girl. But there was more to both of them. They were multifaceted human beings, like we all are, and don't neatly fit inside these boxes. While Susie definitely had a wild side and was known to be outspoken, bordering on mouthy, she was also responsible and did pretty well in school. She had a part-time job down at the local movie theater, and she too had plans for the future. After graduation, she planned to follow in her mother's footsteps and attend cosmetology school. Susie also had her own shining light. And while Stacy was good, she was also a teenage girl, and she did teenage things. She isn't quite the perfect angel that she's often depicted as. She had a little bit of a rebellious streak too that she acted on now and then. In fact, earlier that year, Stacy had been caught sneaking out of her house. She'd gone to some apartment, probably to see a boy, and when she came out, her mama was waiting on her. That is totally something my mom would have done too. Now, I don't bring up any of this to make either of these girls look bad, but just for a general understanding of them. I just feel it's important to cast them all in a more realistic light. Susie and Stacy had grown apart as they got older, but they always remained friendly. And shortly before graduation, it seems they rekindled that old friendship and had started hanging out again. The girls posed together smiling at graduation, and much to the surprise of Susie's other friends, they planned to meet up later that night. After the graduation ceremony, the McCall family returned home, as did Cheryl Levitt and her daughter Susie. Cheryl and Susie picked up a pizza for dinner, and when they arrived home, Susie's best friend, Nigel Kinney, and her boyfriend stopped by to bring Susie a graduation cake. Nigel was a little older, and she attended a different school, so she wouldn't be attending the graduation festivities with Susie, but she made a point to stop by and celebrate her friend. Cheryl had recently purchased their new home at 1717 East Delmar Street. She and Susie had only lived there 3 months, and Cheryl had gone straight to work, turning it into her dream home, ripping down old wallpaper, painting, and even planting flowers outside. It was a work in progress, but Cheryl was pretty crafty, and she loved to make things beautiful again. It was one of the reasons she made such an excellent stylist. As Susie set out that night to celebrate graduation with her friends, Cheryl broke out her paint and varnish to refurnish a chair or a dresser. The articles say both, so I don't really know what piece of furniture it was. But around 9:30 p.m., Cheryl received a call from her best friend Val, and they chatted while she worked. Now, from this point, the timeline that we have for the girls mostly comes from a bunch of partying teenagers out to have a good time on graduation night, and who over time gave shifting and even contradictory accounts of the events of the evening, with a few sightings called in later. But we're going to try our best to line up this timeline the best that we can. Before Stacy left her house, she told her mom, Janice McCall, that the girls were planning on meeting up at Janelle Kirby's house. Then they were going to drive to Branson, where they would stay in a hotel for the night and go to Whitewater Amusement Park the next morning. They arrived at Janelle's house in Battlefield around 8:30 p.m., and Susie arrived shortly before her, around 8:15 p.m. Though there is another account from Janelle's mom, Kathy Kirby, that later claimed that Stacy arrived to their house on time, around 7:30, and Susie arrived late at 8 p.m., but that contradicted the time given by other witnesses. But we do know that around 8:30 p.m., Susie, Stacy, Janelle, and Janelle's boyfriend, Mike Henson, walked next door, according to Janelle, or down the street, according to Kathy Kirby, to another friend's house, Brian Joy, who'd graduated from Kickapoo High School the year before. While Brian did live just one street over, it's actually about a mile walk between Janelle's house and Brian Joy's house. And according to him, Susie and Stacy had asked to spend the night at his house that night, and he told them that they could. When asked why the girls wanted to stay there, he'd simply answered, because my parents weren't home. Now, out of all the events of the evening, there's only one thing we know for sure happened that night. About 10:30 p.m., Stacy called her mom, telling her that they had changed plans, and they had decided to spend the night at Janelle's and just drive to Whitewater in the morning. Janice McCall was actually relieved. She'd worried about them driving around on graduation night, especially making that 45-minute drive in the dark to Branson, a fear she carried from her own graduation when she'd lost 2 of her friends in a tragic car accident. Stacy promised to call her mom again in the morning before they left, and Mrs. McCall went to sleep at peace, knowing that her daughter was safe at her best friend's house, except that she wasn't. Shortly before that call, between 10 and 10:30 p.m., the cashier at Apco A-Mart gas station claimed that he saw the girls. He said they came in together, bought a few items, and while they were inside, a man stuck his head in the door, telling the girls that he forgot to buy cigarettes. The cashier described this man as a white man in his early 30s with dark, stringy, thin hair and a mustache. And he also stated that he vaguely remembered the girls saying something to each other about meeting up later, before they both left in two separate vehicles. Susie and another girl went south on Fremont Avenue, while Stacy got into a brown or dark gold car that appeared to be either a Monte Carlo or a Grand Prix with that man, and they turned north. Police originally considered that clerk's sighting credible, but the girl's friends, aka Janelle, claimed that didn't happen, that she was with them the whole night, that they never went there, and she doesn't even know anyone that drives that kind of car. Though, conveniently, the next known location of the girls was only a mile away, at a party at the home of another of Stacy's friends, Michelle Elder. By about 11:30 p.m., most of the people from Brian Joy's party had moved over to this one, supposedly. And that included Susie and Stacy. And everyone was having a good time. Maybe too much of a good time. And by midnight, there were over 100 people there, spilling out into the front yard and into the street, drinking beer and playing loud music. And according to Michelle, both of the girls were in a good mood. She's quoted as saying, "Nothing was wrong. Everything was perfect." At the party, Michelle and Stacy chatted about how they should hang out more, while Susie talked to the other people. Michelle said that she last spoke to Stacy around 1:30 a.m. and that she seemed happy. But about 20 minutes later, a neighbor called in a noise complaint, and the cops showed up and broke up the party. At that point, the girls headed back, but there are different versions of exactly where and with who. It's generally agreed that they did not drive to that party. They rode with someone else, maybe two different someone else's, if the gas station clerk is correct. But according to their friend, Shane Appleby, when the police arrived, the girls jumped in his Jeep, and he drove them back to Battlefield. And according to him, Susie complained of having a little stomach ache and wanted to go home, and Stacy had already planned to go home with her. He dropped them off at their cars, parked at Brian Joy's house. When he dropped them off, he watched them get out of his vehicle and into their own vehicles and leave. But according to Brian Joy, they went inside, where they were planning to stay, remember? And he told them that they couldn't stay there anymore because too many people were already staying there. And Janelle gave a completely different version of events. She said they rode back with her to her house, that their cars were parked at her house, and the girls were planning to spend the night there, at her house. And according to Kathy Kirby, she'd made the two girls a pallet on the living room floor, and Janelle was going to sleep on the couch since all the rooms were full with visiting relatives that were in town for graduation. But according to them, Susie and Stacy decided at the last minute to go to Susie's house instead, where they could sleep more comfortably in her brand new waterbed. And they were planning to just meet again in the morning to go to Whitewater. And according to a statement by Kathy Kirby, a little after 2 a.m., she heard the girls all come in. And then before they left, overheard Susie say to Stacy, "Follow me to my house." And Stacy replied, "Okay, I will." According to all the stories, the two girls drove off in their little red cars around 2:15 a.m. But what happened from there, we don't know. It's assumed the girls reached Susie's house at 1717 East Delmar around 2:30 a.m. But nobody knows for sure, because in the early morning hours of June 7th, 1992, sometime between 2:30 and 7:30 a.m., Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl Levitt all disappeared without a trace. And over 33 years later, we still don't know what happened to the three missing women. The events of the next day are also strange, and the timeline is a little disjointed. But once again, just like the timeline of the night before, much of what we know about it also comes from Janelle Kirby. The next day, Janelle and her boyfriend, Mike Henson, showed up at the Levitt home looking for the girls. It's hard to say exactly when, since their stories kept changing. But the police report shows that Janelle started calling the house around 7:30 a.m., but kept getting the answering machine. And that around 12:30 p.m., the pair arrived at the Delmar house. They found Susie and Stacy's cars parked in the Circle Drive, and Cheryl's car pulled into the carport. But as they walked up to the door, they noticed broken glass on the steps, which appeared to have come from the broken dome of the porch light, though the porch light itself was still on. And apparently Janelle showed up at Susie's house barefoot and was worried about cutting her feet on the glass. So her and Mike decided to take it upon themselves to sweep up that broken glass. And then Mike carried it across the street to throw it over a fence. Not even a dumpster, like I originally thought, and which was already weird, but over the fence across the street. I have a lot of thoughts about that, but we will come back to it. It's always made it sound like they cleaned up this glass first and then knocked on the door, but that doesn't make much sense to me. Either way, they knocked, nobody answered, and they found it unlocked, so they let themselves in. Inside the home, they found all three women's purses, neatly lined up in a row in Susie's room, with their wallets, keys, and cash still inside. Susie's cigarettes were on her nightstand, and there were used makeup wipes on the bathroom counter. The clothes Stacy had been wearing the night before were stacked neatly on the floor beside the bed, her jewelry tucked in the pockets. The TV was on, but the volume was turned all the way down and static was playing on the screen. And Cinnamon, Cheryl's little Yorkie dog, was absolutely going nuts. But otherwise, besides these very strange things, nothing seemed amiss. The women just weren't there. So even though all of their cars were there, all of their purses were there, all of their belongings were there, and they were not, Janelle and Mike left. And they headed over to a friend's house for a couple of hours, Shane Appleby, who was still asleep when they arrived. Janelle and Mike returned to the Delmar house around 3:30 p.m. Nothing had changed. The women still weren't there. So I guess they just poked around Cheryl's house again, or just kind of hung out in her empty house. They don't say exactly how long they were there, but coincidentally, in the time that they were, the phone rang and Janelle answered it. She said it was some type of obscene prank call, and she hung up, but the caller quickly called back with more obscene remarks. What exactly was in those calls has never been released. Janelle and Mike left again, this time to go get some food. And it was reported that Janelle was crying in the back seat. But Mike assured her that nothing was wrong and that they should just go have some fun. So the two decided to go to the hydro slide in Springfield to swim. And by this time, Janelle and Mike weren't the only people looking for the girls. Janice McCall called the Kirby residence around 11 a.m. looking for Stacy, and she ended up getting into a little argument with Janelle's little sister when she said that Stacy wasn't there. And Mrs. McCall was pretty upset when she learned that Stacy had spent the night at Susie's house and stated that she never would have agreed to that. The McCalls already had a planned family day trip to Lake Springfield. So she decided to go ahead with those plans and she would deal with her wayward daughter later. But before they left, she called Susie's house and left a message on the answering machine instructing Stacy to call her immediately. Another thing that has always stood out to me is that even though Janelle and Mike had visited the house twice already and knew that the women were completely unaccounted for, and Janelle had to know that Mrs. McCall was looking for Stacy, but she never tried to contact her. And finally, as the afternoon wore on, Mrs. McCall actually tracked Janelle down at the hydro slide to try to find out where her daughter was. That's when Janelle told her that yes, Stacy had spent the night at Susie's house, but she still didn't tell her that she had been to Susie's house and the girls weren't there. Even after talking to Janelle, Mrs. McCall was worried. It was very unlike Stacy to go that long without calling, and she was becoming more and more frantic, especially when she received a call from the mother of another of Stacy's friends, Adina, who asked her if she knew that Stacy's car and purse and Susie's car were all at Cheryl's house, but the girls weren't. By the time the sun was going down, Janice McCall was both worried and pissed. She had one of her older daughters ride with her over to Susie's house, planning to have her drive Stacy's car back home. And Mrs. McCall said that she was going to let Stacy look for her car. Since Stacy didn't want to let her know what was going on, she wasn't going to let Stacy know. Janice and her daughter arrived at the Delmar house around 9 p.m. and soon the house was flooded with people. Stu McCall arrived with their older daughter. Janelle Kirby and Mike Henson showed back up with Janelle's parents, and soon followed by her grandparents, and Stacy's friend Adina and her mother Darlene also showed up. These are the names listed on the police report, but there were others too. At least 18 people stomped through Cheryl's house that day, touching things, moving things around, cleaning up, and forever contaminating the crime scene. I still don't know what they were cleaning up though, because it is noted in several places that the home was tidy and everything was in its place. But while all of these people were in the house, the telephone rang again, and it was another lewd prank call. This time Mrs. McCall answered it, and she hung up in disgust. But the group also listened to Cheryl's messages on the answering machine, which is how someone accidentally deleted another disturbing message that may actually have been relevant. But unfortunately, we also don't know what that call or that message said because it also has never been released. In Susie's room, Mrs. McCall found Stacy's clothes and purse and immediately noted that the only items missing were the shirt Stacy had been wearing and her underwear. She noticed Susie's cigarettes on the nightstand and also found Cheryl's cigarettes in another room. And she knew then, for both women to leave their cigarettes behind? No. Something was very, very wrong. Janice McCall called the Springfield police, who arrived to find the house packed with people in confusion. They cleared everybody out, took statements, and Officer Booklet, the responding officer, left his card and a note stuck to the door of 1717 East Delmar, asking Cheryl to call the police department and cancel the missing persons report whenever she and the girls arrived home. But Cheryl never called. But the police department, to their credit, sprang into action. Within the first few days, over 100 people were questioned. Over 20,000 posters of the missing women were posted all over the city, and numerous searches were conducted. Within 2 weeks, 48 Hours, America's Most Wanted, and CBS This Morning aired segments featuring the women, and tips poured in. Over the course of the investigation, officers received hundreds of leads. There's way too many to even try to list all of them, but let's talk about some of the most significant ones. Several tips came in regarding Cheryl's dog, Cinnamon. A neighbor reported the dog coming up to them around 10 p.m. while they were sitting out on their patio. They said the little dog seemed frightened, so they loved on her a little and then placed her back over the fence into Cheryl's yard. Cinnamon was a tiny little thing, so they figured she'd just squeeze through the fence. So they didn't think too much about it until the women were reported missing. But there were other sightings of Cinnamon that night, one about a block away, around 3 a.m. on June 7th, which makes you wonder if she wasn't chasing her mom. Another odd detail is exactly where Cinnamon was when Janelle and Mike Henson arrived to the house. Even on this, their story changed. Early articles claimed they found her in the backyard when they arrived. But in later interviews, Janelle talked about how the dog was going crazy and jumped into her arms when they walked in, indicating that she was roaming around inside. But in other places, it was also reported that they'd found her closed in Cheryl's bathroom. Then, of course, we have the tips about the van, or vans, I should say, since there were actually 3 of them. The very first mention of a van appeared on June 12th, when police announced that they were looking for a 1987 Toyota Supra and a dark blue 1985 Dodge type van that were stolen the same night that the women disappeared. And early reports also show that a tip was received, stating that sometime in the early morning hours, a dark blue van had been seen pulling into the driveway of the Levitt home. Then tips regarding a brown van started popping up. Some witnesses claimed to see a brown van with a rusted bottom and no side or back windows, parked within 1 block of the Levitt home around 4:30 a.m. on June 7th. That van was also described as possibly a Dodge between the years of 1967 and 1970. And then, of course, we have the green van. Weeks after the initial disappearance, a woman known only as the Porch Lady called in a tip that forever altered this investigation. She claimed that in the early morning on June 7th, she'd been sitting on her porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise, when a light green van, driven by a blonde girl who was clearly distressed and sobbing, pulled into the driveway of the house next door. And she overheard a gruff, stern male voice order her to back up and turn around slowly and don't do anything stupid. The Porch Lady believed that that girl could have been Susie Streeter. And the police went wild looking for this van with its unique and distinguishing features. It had large round headlights, and the rear windows appeared to have been painted from the inside. The Porch Lady stated that the coat of paint looked new, and there were no stickers or emblems indicating make or model. It had no license plate, and the front grille was either off-white or slightly rusty. Police tracked down a similar van, painted it the same light metallic green, and parked it outside the police department as a reminder to everyone of what to look for. It's hard to say exactly why the police zeroed in on the green van rather than the others. The blue van was eventually found in October 1993, abandoned in a campground off U.S. Highway 50 in Indiana. Police said that the van had been driven by a couple who also had a truck, and at some point they left in the truck and abandoned the van. But that brown van, which was actually reported by a couple of different witnesses, was just never talked about again. There was also a tip about an unknown transient in the area who was seen near the Levitt home on June 5th and 6th. This man was described as 5'8" to 5'9", roughly between the ages of 34 and 38, about 150 pounds, with shoulder-length, sandy reddish hair. A composite sketch was made, even though when the sketch was printed, it appears to show a man with black hair, which is confusing. But this sketch generated hundreds of calls. And what's very interesting to me about this is that many of those tips pointed to Lebanon and possible suspects in Laclede County. It seems there were 2 notable possibilities there, but they were eventually cleared. The names of these men were never released, and they were described only as white men, one about 30 and the other about 23 or 24. It was also stated that the unknown transient could have been connected to that brown van. Then there were 2 other tips that I consider highly significant. One came from that same gas station. Mr. ST claimed that Cheryl came in around 2:15 a.m., appearing a little frantic and asking if he had seen Susie and her friends. Many people dismissed this alleged sighting, but I don't, because Cheryl and Susie were regulars at that gas station, and gas station attendants know they're regulars. But police told him that he must have been mistaken about it being Cheryl. And apparently another woman later came forward claiming that it was her that came in that night looking for her daughter. But he maintains to this day that that was Cheryl Levitt. The other tip came in from a waitress at George's Steakhouse, a local diner that stayed open all night. She claimed that the 3 women came in together sometime between 1 and 3 a.m. They stayed about 45 minutes, ate, and then left together. The waitress said that Susie seemed giddy and maybe even intoxicated, and that her mom kept trying to calm her down. And she also stated that the women were seen talking to 3 men who were all dressed in Western wear. This tip ended up leading nowhere, and it is also usually dismissed because it doesn't fit the established timeline that we have for the girls. Another tip came in that is no longer often discussed, and I don't know if it should be considered significant or not, but it was called in by a 15-year-old neighbor who claimed that he saw 6 to 8 adults walking from the Levitt residence between 8 and 8:30 p.m. Friday, the night before graduation. He said they were all laughing and joking around, and that the group walked over to the parking lot adjacent to the back of Cheryl's house and loaded into 2 vehicles. A tall man who was wearing a cowboy hat got into a dark-colored full-size pickup truck with a blonde woman, and all the others piled into a car. He could not say if any of these people were Cheryl or Susie. And there's one more tip that I learned about just recently. It didn't even make it into the TikTok versions of these videos. And that is a sighting by a local singer who claimed to see Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl at the bar that she was playing at the night of June 6th. And she was very familiar with them because Cheryl's uncle was working on her house. So she recognized them. She knew it was them. And she said they were not alone there, but it has been too long. She does not know who they were with or how many people they were with, or really can't give any further details. What struck me about this particular tip is that the bar she was playing at was Jagger's Pub, and it ran in this advertisement. She played from 8:30 p.m. until 12:30 a.m. And that bar just so happened to be directly across the street from the gas station where the alleged sightings of Stacy and Susie, and then later Cheryl, happened. What? If the 3 women were at this bar, for real, then the clerk sighting makes perfect sense. It would also wreck the timeline that we have. That was a mind-blowing one. I wanted to add that in here just because it seems so connected to the other possible sightings, and it could establish an entire alternative timeline. Either way, investigators on this case received over 5,000 tips about the 3 missing women. The FBI was called in, numerous searches were conducted throughout the city and in area lakes and creeks and rivers, but not a single trace of the 3 women has ever been found, or at least that's been presented to the public. It's a mystery that's haunted Springfield for the past 33 years. And as much as was done for them, which was a lot in comparison to some other missing person cases, investigators quickly got frustrated with the police department. It was called the most micromanaged case they'd ever seen, and Police Chief Terry Knowles came under a lot of scrutiny for it. It said he wouldn't allow detectives to do their jobs, and seasoned officers were not allowed to use their experience and judgment in this investigation the way that they were in all the others. Some officers claimed key suspects who were believed to have motive were ruled out by the police chief himself. And the lead investigator on the case confirmed that all investigative decisions on their case were made straight out of the chief's conference room. That's only one of several reasons some people believe that there were some, or maybe still are some, in the upper ranks of law enforcement that will not allow this case to be solved. The police also seem to ignore some tips that could have been important, like the fact that Nigel, Susie's best friend, and one of the only people familiar with Cheryl and Susie's routines at the Delmar house, immediately told police that the women's cars had been moved. There was no way they were originally parked like that. She said Susie normally parks in the carport, and if Cheryl was parked there, as her car was parked the day it was found, then Susie would have pulled up behind her. The only reason that Susie would have parked her car in the circle driveway is if there was already another car parked behind her mom. It was also noticed that the tires of Susie's car were slightly off the circle drive, as if parked by someone unfamiliar with a circle driveway. And another odd thing of note is that it was mentioned by someone living nearby that they also thought the cars had been moved. They had passed by early on June 7th, and the cars were parked differently than they had been the first time. If the cars had been moved by someone other than the women, that would change a lot of things. And honestly, it seems to me that the entire focus of the investigation and the established timeline of this case was flawed from the beginning. The search for motive has always heavily centered around Cheryl and Susie. Most seem to believe that Cheryl was the most likely target, since the girls weren't even supposed to be there that night. And over time, she's been rumored and suspected of being involved with all types of shady underworld activity. But as far as I can tell, there's not a lot to back that up. Cheryl appears to have been a normal, law-abiding citizen, though there are still to this day persistent rumors of her being involved with the drug world, specifically cocaine. I can't say for certain if that's true or not. But those that don't believe that Cheryl is the target typically point at Susie. One thing that is generally agreed upon is that Stacy was just a bystander. She just happened to be there. And I get why people think that. After all, it was Cheryl and Susie's house that the three women disappeared from, or are believed to have disappeared from. And why would anyone targeting Stacy kidnap her friend and her friend's mom? But just like most aspects of this case, I think that needs to be reevaluated. Couldn't help but notice that the girls' last night actually revolved a lot around Stacy. The girls met at Stacy's best friend's house and went to parties with their friends. Then they went to the party at Michelle Elder's house, Stacy's other friend. All the last people that the girls were known to be with were Stacy's people, not Susie's. And even most of the witness statements seem to come from Stacy's side of things. From Janelle's mom, from Mrs. McCall. And many times the statements seem to throw a little subtle shade at Susie. In one interview, Janelle Kirby actually referred to Susie as the other girl. Stacy went to the other girl's house. There's kind of a dismissive tone to it that many of them seem to have when talking about her. And when the two girls are spoken about together, they also seem to subtly cast Susie in the more negative light, like Kathy Kirby specifying that Stacy was on time and Susie was late, even though other statements claimed that Susie was actually there first. There was also this strange narrative that was pushed that Susie, Stacy, and Janelle were all just the bestest best friends. And in many articles, it seemed like Janelle tried to center herself as having a more important role in Susie and Stacy's friendship than she actually had. In several articles, statements were made like Kirby was the anchor of the threesome, and if the three were together, Kirby was why. That seems obviously untrue. I'm not even sure Janelle really liked Susie. For example, here Janelle spoke about how hard it was without Stacy, not Susie and Stacy. If Janelle was also such good friends with Susie too, then why does she never show any concern for Susie? It also seems very clear to me that Janelle's timeline for the events of the night was not completely truthful, though it is always presented as absolute fact. It seems pretty obvious that Janelle lied. The timeline doesn't make sense. And with all the changing plans and changing stories, no. Something's off. I'm going to share my personal opinion here because I'm pretty sold on it. But this is just my opinion, so keep that in mind. But I don't think the girls ever really planned to go to Branson. And I don't think Janelle was even with the girls most of the night. I think Janelle was Stacy's alibi. It is very clear that Janice McCall is a strict and protective mother. She kept a close eye on her girls. And what do teenage girls with overprotective parents do when they want to go out and party or meet up with a boy? They lie to their moms. And I know that very well because once upon a time I was that teenage girl with a strict and protective mom that lied to her a lot. Sorry, Mama, I love you. I think the entire Whitewater story was just a cover for Stacy to be out longer than otherwise would be acceptable. I think all the changing plans weren't really changed. That was just Stacy's story. And the only way for her to be able to do what she wanted to do was to convince her mom that she was with Janelle. There were only certain things that Stacy would have been allowed to do, and guaranteed partying all over town wasn't gonna be one of them. I really do believe that Janelle was Stacy's way around her mom. And Janelle, Stacy's best friend since they were in diapers, played along. And she kept playing along and kept repeating Stacy's cover story, never imagining that she'd have to keep repeating it for over 30 years. But notice how no one ever mentions Whitewater, except for Janelle, her mom, and Stacy's mom. Notice how Shane Appleby, their other friend, was still asleep when Janelle and Mike Henson arrived at his house in the afternoon. Obviously, he didn't have any plans of making some group trip to Branson. And notice how Janelle wasn't even at her house when Janice McCall called the Kirby residence looking for Stacy. I guarantee you that Janelle didn't even stay at her own house that night. She likely stayed with her boyfriend, as any freshly graduated senior with a boyfriend would want to. And if Janelle didn't even stay at her own house, there's no damn way the two girls planned to stay there. I actually think that Janelle was with Mike that night, and that they went to the party at Brian Joy's, and I do think the two girls probably stopped by there. But then they left to go do their own thing. I also think that there's really only one good reason that Susie and Stacy would have started hanging out again, and then decide to celebrate graduation night together. And I would bet you money, all the money I have in my bank account, all $2.75 of it, that it had to do with some guys. Stacy may have been interested in someone that Susie was associated with, or maybe both girls liked guys that were in the same friend group, or something along those lines. Which raises the question of who exactly were the other people that Susie was talking to at that party. To say the other people kind of makes it sound like there were people there that Michelle Elder didn't even really know, but that Susie did. Did the girls have some guys meet them at this party? Did they bring some guys with them? I think the answers to these questions, if we could ever find them, could prove valuable. But if we throw out the Whitewater plan completely, then why exactly did Janelle start calling Susie's house at 7:30 in the morning? That's pretty early to be up calling after a night of partying. And what would motivate her and Mike Henson to physically drive over to Susie's house to look for them? Because an interesting fact about all of this is that Janelle Kirby and Mike Henson had never been to Susie's house before. Janelle and Susie weren't even really friends. And Susie hadn't lived in that house very long. How did they even know where she lived? In my mind, I keep going back to the parties. What happened at that last party? Did something go wrong? And where are all the witnesses? You would think that more people that were there would openly talk about it, about being there with them, about seeing the girls that night. It was reported that there were over 100 people at Michelle Elder's party. Why have none of them come forward about what they saw or heard or experienced? That one really bothers me, and I would really love to get a hold of anybody that was there and talk to them personally. I also keep thinking about the next day and Janelle crying in the back seat. Somebody had to be with them. Because why would Janelle be in the back seat if it was just her and Mike Henson? It would have been Mike Henson driving and Janelle in the passenger seat. The only way for Janelle to have been crying in the back seat would have been for someone else to be in the passenger seat. There had to be someone with them. But who? Could it have been someone who knew where Susie lived? That could explain how Janelle and Mike Henson knew where to go. And it could also explain why they felt so comfortable just waltzing in Cheryl's house like that. If someone was with them that knew Cheryl and knew Susie and had been there before, it seems a little less strange. I mean, it's still odd, but less so. So that's a big question for me is, who was that third person? Why were they never mentioned? Why are they not named? Why so secretive? That's very suspicious to me. And look, I'm not insinuating that the teenagers had anything to do with it. I'm not insinuating that Janelle and Mike Henson had anything to do with the women's disappearance. But I am absolutely insinuating that there is something wrong with this timeline. I don't know why they did what they did. I don't know why they would lie. I don't know why they would walk in Cheryl's house and touch things and completely compromise the crime scene. The only thing I can think of is that Janelle was covering for Stacy in some way, shape, or form. Because I also do believe that at the beginning, Janelle did believe that the girls would come back, that they would eventually show back up. So she kept lying, not wanting to get Stacy in trouble, thinking she was being a good friend. And by the time they all realized that something truly terrible may have happened, it would have been too late. The lie would have grown too big, and to change their story could have made them suspects. And I don't think they were the only ones lying either. I think actually there were a lot of little lies told about that night. These were a bunch of teenagers partying, drinking, probably smoking some weed and doing stuff they had no business doing. Some of them likely had parties their parents didn't know about. Others were likely at parties their parents didn't know they were at. And I really think that makes this timeline a cluster F of a bunch of lying teenagers trying to cover their tracks and each other's tracks for just doing typical teenage stuff. But by doing so, it completely scrambled the series of events and the timeline that we need for the three missing women. It completely destroyed any chance we had of retracing the girls' final steps. So I strongly believe that if there is any hope of ever seeing this case solved, that every single aspect of it needs to be carefully re-examined and every person involved looked over with a critical eye. And while I understand that many people look down on gossip and speculation, and I do understand that some conversations can be hurtful for some of the loved ones of the missing women, I truly believe that this case desperately needs fresh eyes and new perspectives and open discussion, which is exactly what I'm trying to do here, because here's another strange thing that I've noticed, that despite this case being widely covered by reporters and podcasters and content creators, no one really ever stops to question the oddity of the events or the inconsistencies in the statements. And the people who do are often attacked and even kicked out of discussion groups and discussion boards for even slightly deviating from the generally accepted narrative. But if that tightly controlled narrative has not yielded any answers after 33 years, then maybe it's time to accept that that's not the correct one. If this case is ever going to be solved, if we ever hope to find these women, we all got to start thinking outside the box and stop shaming each other for doing so. So guys, I really want y'all to know that we are safe to discuss here. I want to hear all of y'all's thoughts and opinions, and I don't care if it's generally accepted or not. All discussion is welcome, and I encourage you to share your thoughts and opinions too. I honestly want to hear it. This case is astonishingly complex and bizarre, and it just gets weirder. when we start to examine the list of possible suspects and persons of interest, which we will do in the next video. And I will try to get that up as soon as possible. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and do all the YouTube things. Thanks for listening, guys, and I'll see y'all next time.